New Year's Eve. It's a night filled with excitement and anticipation. Everyone counts down to midnight, waiting for the fresh start that a new year promises. But for me, one New Year's Eve changed my life forever. I didn't expect the night to end the way it did. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it wasn't real. But even now, the memories of that night creep back in, and the questions still haunt me. Maybe sharing this will help me make sense of it, or warn someone else. It started as a simple idea, a getaway with friends to a cabin we found online. We were excited, no responsibilities, no distractions, just us and the New Year's Eve celebration. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, completely isolated. It sounded perfect. We arrived in the late afternoon. It was colder than we expected, and as we unpacked, the first oddity presented itself. The front door was slightly open. None of us thought much of it. We assumed the wind must have blown it ajar. Inside, the place was rustic, charming even, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. It felt unwelcoming. We spent the evening cooking, laughing, and reminiscing, and for a while, I forgot about the unease I felt when we arrived. But around 10 p.m., things started to feel strange. First, it was the power. The lights flickered, then went out entirely. We scrambled for candles and flashlights, joking nervously that the cabin was already proving to be an adventure. Then, we heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the roof. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like someone was walking slowly across the shingles. We all froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Probably a raccoon, someone suggested, though their voice lacked conviction. We tried to ignore it and went back to our games. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved, slowly, from one end of the roof to the other. One of us finally worked up the courage to go outside and check. He came back pale, saying, "There's nothing there. The snow on the roof is untouched." By the time midnight approached, we were all on edge. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. As the countdown began, I remember thinking, something isn't right. At the stroke of midnight, the scream cut through the air. It wasn't human, it was guttural, chilling, and it came from the woods just beyond the cabin. We all rushed to the windows, but there was nothing to see. Just endless darkness. And then, we noticed one of us was missing. They had gone outside just before the countdown and hadn't returned. We searched for hours, calling their name into the void, but they finally stumbled back into the cabin, shaking and refusing to speak. The only thing they managed to say was, "We need to leave." The next morning, we packed up in silence and left without looking back. Weeks later, I found out that the cabin had a history. Every New Year's Eve, someone who stayed there reported hearing the same scream, and sometimes people didn't return at all. I first heard about the ritual from a co-worker. She said it was just an old New Year's Eve superstition. Light a single candle, sit in front of a mirror at midnight, and focus on your reflection. They said you'd see your future, but you had to blow out the candle before the clock struck 12:01. I didn't believe it, but I was curious enough to try. I was alone that year, so it seemed like a harmless way to pass the time. I set up everything, placed the mirror on my desk, lit the candle, and turned off all the lights. The room was completely dark, except for the small flicker of the flame. It was eerie, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. When the clock hit 11:59, I stared at my reflection, waiting. At first, nothing happened. I almost laughed at how silly I felt. But then I noticed it. My reflection wasn't moving the same way I was. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, even though I hadn't moved. I leaned closer, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the closer I got, the more I realized the reflection wasn't just mimicking me. It was alive. And it was smiling. not in a comforting way, but like it knew something I didn't. At exactly midnight, the candle started to flicker violently. I reached out to blow it out, but before I could, my reflection raised a hand, not to mirror me, but to press against the glass. And then, it whispered something. I don't know how to explain it, but I heard it in my head. It's your turn. The candle went out on its own, and the room plunged into darkness. I scrambled to turn the lights back on, but when I did, the mirror was cracked, and my reflection wasn't there. I threw the mirror away the next day. But even now, sometimes, when I look into a reflective surface, I feel like I'm being watched. I haven't done the ritual again, and I don't plan to. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't me.